The NBA currently is in a position that we have not seen in a very long time, as currently there really is no consensus of who is the best player in the NBA. And as you can see from the title and thumbnail, we're going to be talking about that spot and who I believe is the best player in the league. When you look around the NBA, there's a lot of players and a lot of talent in this league. And I genuinely think it's even gotten to that point where the top 10 players in the NBA all at least have the talent to be the best player in the league, but some have just done more and hence they're in that conversation, and others just have not done enough yet with that talent. Hence they are not in the conversation. Because as good as guys like Luka Doncic, Nikola Jokic, James Harden, Joel Embiid, and Anthony Davis are, they are very talented players, don't get me wrong, but they have not nearly had the playoff success, especially as the best player, as guys that are in the top 5 in my personal opinion that I'm going to be talking about later on in this video. But then that begs the question, who is in that conversation? Who is in the mix of being the best player in the NBA? And that brings me to my first player that I want to talk about in that conversation, and that's Steph Curry. Now, Steph Curry had a historic season last year, shooting splits that are ridiculous, and had one of the craziest months of basketball in April that I have ever seen. Like, honestly, that might be the greatest stretch of games of all time, and that is no exaggeration, honestly. And when you combine that with the fact that he was an MVP candidate, made first team All-NBA, and has a resume of championships and MVPs, and one of them being unanimous, it's really no surprise that Steph is in this conversation. As though defensively, he is definitely not the greatest player in the world. He might be the worst defensive player in the top 10 players in the league, but what he does on the offensive end, his playmaking combined with his three-point shooting, he might be the best offensive player of all time. And it's crazy because coming into this season, people thought he was going to get quote-unquote exposed because he didn't have Klay Thompson to protect him anymore on the defensive end. And after like 2 to 3 bad games to start off the season and the Warriors getting blown out almost every single game, it felt like, people were so quick to jump on the Steph Curry hate bandwagon, but the guy went out there and responded by having arguably his best season to date. So with all that being said, why can't he be the best player in the NBA? Is it the defense? Because that's a valid argument. Like I said earlier, you could argue he's the worst defender in the top 10. Or is it the fact that he missed the playoffs last year? Because that is also something that you have to consider. If you're the best player in the league, you should be able to lead your team to the playoffs despite the talent not always being the most adequate. And I know a lot of people are going to bring up injuries, as Steph Curry missed 9 games, and that may not seem like that much, but considering it was a condensed 72 game season, they were at the bottom of the Western Conference, every single game counts, and they went 1-8 without him. That is definitely a valid argument. But that kind of does feed into the argument of why he can't be the best player in the world. Steph Curry has been a fairly injury-prone player for a good portion of his career. Hell, him being injury-prone is kind of the reason why they were even able to get a guy like Kevin Durant, because Steph Curry was underpaid due to his injuries in the past. And no matter how talented you are, the best ability is availability, and durability should count for something when you're talking about the best player in the league. Because if we're being honest, that's why a guy like Joel Embiid, who is a beast on both ends of the court and just finished second in the MVP race, is not in this conversation. But speaking of conversations, let's then shift it to another player and talk about LeBron James. Now, King James has been the best player in the NBA essentially over the last decade, but over the last couple of years, he hasn't always been the clear-cut best player, as certain guys have taken the crown every now and then. But nonetheless, LeBron James is still in this conversation. His ability as a playmaker rivals some all-time greats, even at this point in his career, as he settled more into that point guard facilitator type of role. And on the defensive end, ever since he got Anthony Davis, he has shown a lot more motivation, and I personally believe that he was in the Defensive Player of the Year race last year and was on pace to make an all-defensive team had he not gotten injured. But then that brings us to a similar point against Steph Curry. The best ability is availability, and LeBron James over the last 3 years, essentially since he's gotten to LA, has not always been available due to his lack of durability. And considering that he's not going to get any younger, it's a fair assumption to make that LeBron James' durability is only going to get worse from this point forward. And yes, I understand they did win a championship just about a year ago, with LeBron James playing at a historic level throughout the entire postseason, but unfortunately we have to use context, and they had a 4-month layoff, and for a guy that's entering the ending of his 30s, yeah, that definitely contributed to him being at peak condition entering the bubble. But speaking of the bubble, that brings us to a guy that probably wants to forget about it, and that is Kawhi Leonard. Now, Kawhi's case for being the best player in the world is a very interesting one, because when you look at what he does in the regular season, you probably ask yourself, why is he in this conversation? He's a good scorer and also he's a great defender, but his numbers are not as good as other guys. And yes, he's great, but there are just other guys who play better in the regular season, and that's a safe assumption, and I would actually tend to agree with that. But in the playoffs, Kawhi Leonard just turns into a different beast, as already by the age of 30 has cemented himself as one of the greatest playoff performers of all time. As this postseason, before going down with an injury against the Utah Jazz in Game 4, he was already on pace to have another all-time great playoff run, averaging 30 points along with 8 rebounds and 4 assists, 2 steals on insane shooting splits of 57% from the field, 39% from behind the arc, and 88% at the free throw line. Couple that with the fact that he led the Los Angeles Clippers from back-to-back 2-0 deficits in the first and second round, and you have a playoff run that was already on pace to be one of the all-time great playoff runs. But unfortunately, despite his great playoff exploits this past postseason, there are some weaknesses in Kawhi Leonard's game. Though he is an elite scorer with an unstoppable mid-range game, his playmaking can be limited, especially if you trap him at his spots. And as we saw last year against the Denver Nuggets, once they actually did that and forced him into a playmaking role, Kawhi just could not get the job done, as they eventually blew a 3-1 lead. But ironically, similar to LeBron and similar to Steph Curry, another problem with Kawhi is health. As over the last couple of years, he has load managed in the regular season, and though it has ultimately paid off with 2 titles on his resume along with 2 finals MVPs, this past postseason was a different story, as he ended his playoff run with an injury, a partial ACL tear to be exact. And when you combine his injuries with the fact that he's not that great of a playmaker compared to his other counterparts in the top 5 and top 10, I have to say, it really is tough to make a case for Kawhi to be the best, but he does have elite defense going for him, and outside of Giannis, you could argue he's the best defender in the top 5 and in the top 10 as well. But on the flip side, when you talk about offense, how could I forget the name Kevin Durant? Because after what we saw this postseason, there really is no debate about it. KD is back, because to be in a series against the eventual NBA champion Milwaukee Bucks and to be down your 2 best players, and then eventually one of them comes back and is used as a decoy because he is obviously not 100%, and then you go out there and drop 49 points, 17 rebounds, deliver 10 assists along with 3 steals, 2 blocks, and shoot just short of 70% from the field, 44% from behind the arc, and 81% at the free throw line. That is one of the all-time great playoff performances, and though they did lose in 7 games, he would drop another 48-point performance in Game 7 and was just 1 shot away from winning the series. And yes, I know he went 0 of 6 in overtime, but I honestly chalk a lot of that up to exhaustion, the fact that James Harden didn't do anything, like literally absolutely anything in that series, and Joe Harris just could not buy a single 3 whatsoever. And even from a talent perspective, there really is no debate on KD being in this conversation. The guy can do everything on the offensive side of the ball, because we all know as a scorer, he's one of the greatest scorers of all time, arguably the best scorer to ever touch a basketball. And when you combine that with the fact that he's even grown and shown strides as a playmaker this past regular season and even in the playoffs, because despite all of the misses of Joe Harris, KD did record 10 assists in that legendary Game 5, and a lot of that was to Jeff Green, who knocked down 7 threes. KD really has a legitimate argument to be the best player in the world, because even on the defensive end, he may not be a Kawhi Leonard or he may not be a Giannis, but he's still no liability whatsoever. So with all things being considered, there really isn't any major weakness in Kevin Durant's game. There are just things that I think other guys on this list can do better. Defensively, I would take a Kawhi or a LeBron or a Giannis over him. As a shooter, I would take a Steph Curry over him. As a playmaker, I would take a LeBron over him, as well as a Steph also. But as far as what he does best, which is put the ball in the hoop, his ability to do that in a multitude of different ways at every single level being at 7 feet tall, it really is just something special to watch. But speaking of something special to watch, that brings us to the man of the postseason, the guy who actually beat Kevin Durant in that playoff series, Giannis Antetokounmpo, the 2-time MVP and Defensive Player of the Year, the man who just capped off a historic playoff run on both sides of the ball, concluding it with a 50-piece along with 14 rebounds and 5 blocks. I gotta say, Giannis is easily in this conversation just for this playoff run alone. Because when you talk about Giannis's flaws and his inabilities over the past couple of years of his career, the real issues have been the fact that Giannis has not been a closer, and he's also not been a great shooter, not only from the 3-point line, but also from the free throw line. But in the playoffs, he stepped up numerous times in the fourth quarter, hitting clutch shot after clutch shot. And yes, I know Middleton was the guy who closed it with the big shots at the end, but Giannis did his part. Let's not forget that before Middleton hit the dagger against the Brooklyn Nets in Game 7, Giannis hit his hook shot on Kevin Durant. Let's also not forget that throughout all of the fourth quarters, Giannis in the NBA Finals had shot 20 of 28 from the field, scoring 56 points on 71% shooting. And in the fourth quarter of Game 6, he actually recorded 11 points, shooting 4 of 5 from the field, which translates to 80%. And as well as that efficient fourth quarter scoring in the NBA Finals, what was also the knock? His free throws. And he converted 17 of 19 free throw attempts in Game 6. All the criticisms that people had about Giannis, he shut all of them down throughout this entire playoff run. And if you want to diminish it by saying injuries got in the way, primarily in that Brooklyn Nets series, I really don't want to hear it, because by that logic, we have to diminish so many playoff runs, and the guy was still dominant. You can only play what's in front of you, and Giannis played what's in front of him at an elite to all-time level. This was an all-time great playoff run, no matter how you slice it and dice it, in my personal opinion. The plays that he was making on both ends of the ball is something that only a select few players in NBA history have the capabilities of doing. The block on DeAndre Ayton in Game 4, the lob from Jrue Holiday in Game 5, the 5 blocks that he was making in Game 6 of the NBA Finals alone. Because whether it was post hooks or whether it was chase downs, straight up blocks, insane alley-oops, Giannis was able to do things that, like I said earlier, a select few players in NBA history can do. And that shouldn't be something that we overlook just because Kyrie Irving and James Harden got hurt in the second round. But that then leads into the big question of this video. Who is currently the best player in the NBA? And my answer is Giannis. And I'm not going to spend too much time explaining it because I just broke down the argument somewhat in the last segment. And it really is so simple. It comes down to this. Giannis over the last 3 years has been the most dominant player in the league, winning back-to-back MVPs along with the Defensive Player of the Year. And the consistent knocks on Giannis, he was able to overcome them. He was able to play make out of the post when the double teams came, which was a big issue against the Raptors and the Miami Heat. He was able to make shots in the mid-range game, which was a big issue against the Raptors and the Miami Heat. He was also able to knock down his free throws in the biggest game of his career, Game 6 of the NBA Finals, a game in which he had arguably the greatest game of all time in the NBA Finals with a 50-piece. And the plays that he was making on the way to the finals and in the NBA Finals on both sides of the ball, I can't imagine a Kevin Durant doing that. I can't imagine LeBron at 36 doing that. I can't imagine Kawhi Leonard doing that. And I sure as hell can't imagine Steph Curry doing that. And in an era of super teams and spacing, the fact that the Milwaukee Bucks won while being one of the worst three-point shooting teams in NBA Finals history is a testament to how great they were on the defensive end and the fact that they imposed themselves in the paint. And who was the biggest proponent of that? Giannis Antetokounmpo. So if you ask me, the best player in the world is the Greek Freak himself. But that's just my opinion. I'm sure a lot of you guys will disagree. Let me know your opinions down below in the comment section. I will interact with as many people as possible. Feel free to also drop a like and subscribe to the channel to help me out with the algorithm, and join the family by not only subscribing but pressing the bell for post notifications. This is your boy Young Mustard signing out. Y'all stay safe and have a blessed day. Peace.